Perfect, great. Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to this afternoon's session about buses. I'm Ben Plowden. I'm the Chief Executive of the Campaign for Better Transport. We're a national charity campaigning for better transport in communities throughout England and Wales, by which we mean better public transport, walking, cycling, wheeling, shared mobility and zero-emission vehicles. And we're here today to talk about buses. So let me start with some audience research. Hands up if you've been on a bus in the last week. Hands up if you haven't been on a bus in the last week. Hands up if you've not got on a bus unless it killed you. No, good, okay. So we're talking about buses, and in particular what a minimum level of bus service might be for communities throughout the country, and that might vary according to the geography of those communities. And to help us do that, we're going to have a presentation from my colleague Sylvia Barrett from the Campaign for Better Transport, and then a discussion with a very esteemed panel who I'll introduce in a minute before we get to the panel discussion. But I wanted to start with a few statistics to kind of set today's conversation in context. So we'll hear from Sylvia in a minute about what it might cost, we think, from our research to improve bus services across the country to a reasonable level of standard, which she will define. But just to hold in mind the fact that we spend £200 billion a year, give or take, on the NHS, 94% of which is revenue spend. But we don't talk about subsidising healthcare. We invest in doctors and nurses and porters and drugs. And most of the cost of the NHS, which we invest in, is revenue investment. So we might come back in a minute to talk about whether the number that Sylvia will tell you is a big number or not in terms of what we might need to invest. The second statistic is to tell you that 46% of the local transport authorities, cited it in a recent DfT report, said that their ability to deliver better transport in their communities was poor or very poor. Not a criticism of them, but the fact that because 70% of the budget of the average local authority goes on social care, their capacity to plan and commission and oversee transport in their local area is very, very constrained. And I suspect the panel, Andy in particular, want to talk about that as we go through the course of the session. And the third statistic is to tell you, of course, that buses are the most commonly used form of public transport. About 60% of public transport journeys are on buses. So they are the backbone of the transport system all through the country. And in communities where there is no bus service, they obviously have significant disadvantages as a consequence of that. So what we're going to start with is Sylvia Barrett, my colleague from TfL, Campaign for Better Transport, I used to be at TfL, talking about the work we've been doing with Podaris on how you define a minimum level of bus service. Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to present to you the work that we have been doing in partnership with Podaris, very kindly looking at how do we define a bus service standard and how do we identify the gaps in provision. So where our thinking on this started from is from our belief that having access to a decent level of bus service provision should be an essential public right. And this is because having inadequate bus provision can mean people missing out on education, on employment opportunities, on essential services and social interactions. And that is particularly the case for people on low to middle incomes who might be less able to afford a private car, for example. In terms of the policy context, with the new Bus Services Act, local authorities are now required to identify existing bus services that are socially necessary. So these are services that, if they're taken away, the community would suffer from worse access to opportunities and services. But the Act does not require local authorities to also identify gaps in provision. So not only what the current network is, but what we might need to provide in order to plug those gaps in provision. This is why we have been working with Podaris in order to define a bus service standard and to identify any gaps. Oh, that is hard. In order to do that, we set the parameters on the basis of three main metrics. The first one is population density as measured by people per hectare. And this is because for different locations, based on density, on whether it's urban or rural, you would have different expectations for the bus service network. The second metric is bus stop access. And this is measured on the basis of the percentage of the population who can access a bus stop within a 5 or 10 minute walk, which is a standard transport planning measure. And that's based on, obviously, data that's available nationally as well. And the third metric is bus service frequency. So here we took the percentage of the population who have access to at least a certain number of bus trips per week. An important thing to say here is that it is deliberately a simple measure, so it doesn't, necessarily differentiate between sort of really dense peak time service versus very poor evening and weekend service. But this is because we wanted to take the sort of the main part of what bus services provide. And it does not measure access to services, unlike, for example, the Department for Transport connectivity tool, because this is a complementary tool. So in essence, we think that bus is an essential public service. We think there needs to be a baseline that people who rely on buses need to have access to, and this is what we have measured here. So we then took these metrics and we defined two service standards. So the first one is a minimum baseline, and this is the minimum level of the network that we believe people should be able to expect. And this is similar to the socially necessary services definition, which I described. But we also thought about, well, what does good look like? So we also defined an ambition benchmark. This is the best practice service level that we believe authorities and operators should be aspiring to reach within 10 years with additional funding, and this is closer to expected goods level of standards. So, we then looked at the parameters, setting parameters on the basis of the three metrics which I described. I won't read through them. Hopefully you can see the sort of metrics we described, but essentially from high to medium and low frequency, high, low, and medium density places, we've got denser provision and more frequent services in high density places, and lower frequency for rural places, because it's more, that's the cost-effective and expected level of service provision. But with the ambition benchmark, we have increased the service frequency and we have increased the percentage of the population who are able to access those services as well. The other important thing to measure is this is not a measure of bus use, but it's a measure of bus provision. And the idea is that with increased frequency, with increased access to bus services, more people would then be able to use those services as well. So the analysis was done on the ward level, and we scored each ward on the basis of these parameters, depending on whether they met one or both of these parameters. So green were the wards that meet both standard parameters for frequency of services and bus stop density. Yellow places were those that do not meet the bus stop density standards, so they require additional bus stops. And the amber places was those that have sufficient bus stops, but they require additional bus service frequencies. And red were the places that fall short in terms of both bus stop density and service frequency. I guess one other thing to mention is that this analysis needs to be reflected and discussed through the lens of the local knowledge. So this is what the map looks like in the composite, and you can see the minimum baseline on the left and the ambition benchmark on the right. You'll see the difference there that from the baseline to the benchmark, there's many more places that then become red and amber. So these are the places that need additional investment if we are to reach that best practice standard. And this is the analysis of how many wards fall under each under each score. So if we look at the minimum baseline, we can see that it's 15% of the population, 15% of people live in places that fall below the baseline. So we believe that these wards, particularly those in the red category, that are in critical need of investment in order to deliver that essential service that we aspire towards. And on the right, we have the places that fall below the ambition benchmark, and this is the long-term investment ambition for the number of wards that we believe need to be brought up to that standard level. The tool will be available on request, so my details will be at the end of the presentation, and you'll be able to sort of request access to that. We're still in the sort of analysis stage, but when you go into the tool, you will be able to, this is what the data looks like for a specific ward. So when you click on a ward, you'll be able to see its score, you'll be able to see the density requirements, and also it shows you the percentage of the population that are within an exact distance from the nearest bus stop, and the percentage that have an access to specific frequency of bus services. So it's a very rich data tool, which I hope will be useful to people who are looking at planning bus service improvements. But what does it show us in totality? So it shows us that investment is still needed. In some places, it might be an increased frequency of an existing service. In other places, it might be improved evening or weekend services, or it might be an extended or additional routes. In other places, particularly those that are yellow, would require additional bus stops where services already exist. But there's also a recognition here that scheduled bus services are not the only type of local transport services. And there's also things like digital demand responsive transport, community transport, that together with buses need to form a cohesive network. And hopefully this is something we'll be talking about in the panel. But these are the estimates that Ben mentioned at the start. So we looked at how much will it cost to deliver these improvements if we're not to take funding away from services that are already supported. So for the baseline, it will require 302 million a year in order to achieve that baseline. And for the higher ambition benchmark, we estimate that still under $1 billion of additional funding that will be required. And this is funding a year, but the assumption here is that the revenue investment requirement would also reduce over time as passenger numbers increase. So if we're looking at a 5-year period, it will be less than the sum of 5 times this number. Conscious I'm running out of time, in terms of next steps, we will be sharing findings with selected stakeholder organizations, so please get in touch if you would like to discuss that. And we will be looking at what does that mean in terms of policy recommendations. We will be following up with a more detailed policy report later this year. But in the meantime, we would encourage local authorities and operators to use these findings in order to inform their future bus improvement plans. With the long-term funding settlements now determined, this is the right moment for local authorities to be looking at this. And we are also working very closely with the Department of Transport to look at future funding allocations and what does that mean. So please get in touch if you would like to discuss that further. So I'm going to play a short video that we were sent by Julia Buckley MP. She's the MP for Shropshire, and we welcome Julia's thoughts on the value of this tool. Can we play that, please?
I'm Julia Buckley and I'm the MP here in Shrewsbury, the county town for the whole county of Shropshire. And we lost over 65% of our bus routes over the last decade. So we've ended up with communities, whole villages and lots of young people disconnected from work, training, health facilities, even just our shops here in the centre. So a mapping exercise that can help us identify those gaps and work together with us as we're gradually building back our services would be so beneficial. We are trying to emulate what's happening in Greater Manchester and Birmingham. We want to have that fabulous bus plan and put back our missing services. We've had a recent success by rebuilding our night bus, so that's hourly services from 8 right through to midnight here in Shrewsbury. So help us on our journey and give us the map that can put us in the right direction.
So as Julia says, we hope that this tool will be of great use to authorities and planners. And even though we have an ask for additional funding from the Department and Treasury, additional bus services also bring many social and economic benefits and a great value for money. And with that, I hand over to Ben to discuss on the panel.
Brilliant. So before you go, so Sylvia's not going to be on the panel, so can I just check if there's anybody in the audience who wants to just ask any kind of technical questions about the methodology that Sylvia just summarised? And I realise there's no mic in the room, so if you do want to ask a question, you're going to have to shout really loudly, and hopefully one of my colleagues. So anybody just want to check they've understood the approach we've taken, any questions about the kind of technical aspects of this methodology? Yeah.
Just one quick one. You very briefly alluded to different routes or new routes, but the rest of the presentation seemed to talk about more stops. Sorry, you said no mic. So
Yeah, no, it came in. I didn't realise. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'll start again. Sorry. Anna Jane Hunter, the chair of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. So you mentioned mainly about additional stops, additional services that were already there, but then you briefly mentioned new routes or expanded routes. So I just wondered if you could expand a little bit, and I appreciate we're short on time. To what extent did the research take into account, does bus provision go where people want it to go, I suppose is what I'm asking, if that makes sense.
Yes, so we looked at the data on the basis of the nationally available data for bus frequency and for bus stops provision. And that is because we wanted to have a simple metric to identify that minimum service requirement. But when you go into the tool, you can actually see the exact percentage of the population that has access to the exact frequency of services. That's the important thing is, as I said at the start, is having that local knowledge as well. So with the local authority, with the operators, looking at what the current network is, but focusing on those places that require the additional services, the additional bus stops, so the yellow, the amber, the red places. And what does that mean in practice? One thing is that demand responsive transport is not included in the board's data that we have used, so that's another sort of layer of additional knowledge that will be required. But Devon from Podaris is in the audience. I'm sure they'll be very happy to have local authorities, look at additional more bespoke research with Podaris.
Devon, you should put your hand up so everyone knows who you are. You can get there's Devon. Great. Any other just technical questions before I come to the panel? Just to check. Yeah, question about, and then we'll.
It was obviously mentioned that it factors in frequency to the methodology, but does it also factor in the availability of routes like that can take you to a different part of the city or maybe different rural areas? Because particularly in rural areas, you get maybe one bus every 2 hours that goes to one town and another town on the other end, but there's not much option to go north or south, say.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is why we varied the parameters on the basis of population density and on the basis of population clusters as well. So if you go into the tool, you'll be able to sort of zoom in and see the actual bus stops and the house codes that those serve. And you can actually, almost picture the network as it was. So rural places are among the most places in need, and we have more in-depth data that we'll be publishing in the report to come. But yes, absolutely, they're the places that are less commercially viable and more harder to provide, and that's why it's important to link to the wider network as well of community transport and demand-responsive vehicles as well.
I come
Brilliant.
from rural
Okay.
Somerset, so the frequency part really hits home. It's a bus every 2 hours and it doesn't even go to the train station.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to have an ambition benchmark as well. So that's getting closer to the every village, every hour vision that CPRE, for example, have put together. So
Great.
I'll leave it there.
Super, thank you very much indeed. And if you have any other questions, Sylvia, grab her after the session. I'm just keen to come to the panel, which we'll now do. So we have, as I said, a very esteemed panel with us this afternoon. On my immediate left is Andy Summers, the Chief Executive of Transport East, which is the subnational transport body for the east of England. I'm sure he'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Caroline Whitney, who's the England Director and also Head of Membership Services for the Community Transport Association. And then Nick Jessup, who is a Policy Manager at the Confederation of Passenger Transport. So I'm going to come to you in turn one at a time. Andy, I guess two questions for you. One is, what effect does not having access to a decent bus service have, do you think, on communities in your part of the world or more generally? And then secondly, what do you think are the main barriers, apart from the availability of funding, to local authorities being able to put on a better level of bus service?
Yeah, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. I'm Andrew Summers. My area I cover is Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Southend and Thurrock. So for the purposes of today, very much a rural, sparsely populated region with about 75 towns and cities, but no dominant metropolitan area. So an interesting case study, I think. Should also mention that Transport East is the Rural Mobility Centre of Excellence, and so we've developed a lot of evidence and data around this type of challenge. Ben, I'd probably go back to your earlier point about elevating the narrative and the importance of bus in the wider outcomes that we're trying to seek. And if you sort of take the classic advantage of when you ask the cleaner at NASA, what do? They help put people onto the moon. In the same case, what does bus do in places like the east of England? The east ultimately feeds the nation, powers the UK and trades with the world. It just so happens it's a very rural area at the same time. And so we have a huge contribution that our transport network plays to the coherence of the national economy. And if we think about where we're heading at the minute, national security as well. We're going to power 95% of UK homes. We've got a third of the arable farmland. And so a significant part of the the wealth and the continuation of cities in the UK depends on places like the East. But subsequently, within the East, you need that economy to work. We're growing as well. We've got 500,000 new homes projected to be built between now and 2050. So how do we ensure that the economy of the East grows and supports that of the wider UK? And one of the main constraints we have is around our transport networks, overcrowding, poor accessibility. And so this is where the bus comes in. It's elevating it from, I guess, the conversations we're having in a very siloed, sort of DFT-focused world to this supports the government missions, this supports the future vitality of the country. Just to hone in a bit on that, on one piece of research we've done, which is about young people. So if we see young people as the drivers of economy today and going forwards, how do we equip them to be able to be leaders and drivers, within jobs going forwards? We interviewed 1,000 young people last year who live in our rural areas, particularly on public transport. And you can see that the lack of availability of public transport is really holding back their life chances, but also the vitality of the economy within our local area and the ability of those people to then feed the jobs pipeline of the future. So we found that 60% of them rely on the bus. 52% of those that live in rural areas can't access colleges in under half an hour. And crucially, 2/3 of them arrive late to their lessons because of a lack of frequency. And I think some people have already talked about frequency. So when you ask the question, what are the challenges? How's it holding back our outcomes? It really is holding back our outcomes. It impacts on other generations. So one anecdotal comment from that research we did, someone said, my granddad had to quit his job to take me to college. So it really impacts on people. And you can multiply that example by 3.5 million people that live in the East. So there really are a range of outcomes that are being held back in terms of the economy, in terms of social exclusion. In terms of what the specific barriers are, I think I've talked about frequency, the availability, so the network coverage, making sure it gets to those places where there are jobs going forwards. And there are a lot of jobs in the East. You think Sizewell C, there's going to be a nuclear power station. 10,000 people are going to be working there. We're going to want young people to access there. How do you get, that's predominantly in a rural area, how do you get people to those jobs? So the ability of local authorities to plan for that, a cohesive bus network. So the last point in terms of your question around what are the barriers to local authorities, not only funding, which we'll probably come on to in a bit, but it's the capacity and capability of those local authorities themselves to be able to take forward this planning and delivery. There's some absolute heroics taking place within local authorities at the minute through the enhanced partnerships, through the work that Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex are doing, but giving them a hand to do even better would be a great start going forwards.
Brilliant. Andy, thank you very much. Caroline, Sylvia mentioned in passing that there are other forms of local transport in the areas that Andy's just been describing. What do you think we need to do to kind of, first of all, understand the nature and extent of those other forms of public transport or community transport, and then make sure that the totality of that with formal bus service provision adds up to a whole which is greater than some of its parts? What do we need to do there?
So I think one of the... Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
It's okay. Yeah. I can't hear myself, so that's an interesting one. Didn't think it was on. So the challenge around kind of our sector in terms of the non-commercial sector is that we're funded in such different ways that it's not always an easy way to kind of go, okay, what's actually being delivered? So, because local authorities don't deliver, or don't fund, sorry, and don't invest in everything that our operators deliver. So there's never an easy kind of, just do a quick mapping bit, because actually a service that's delivered this year might not be there next year because it was grant funded. So that's the big part for us, that we are cyclical in our nature because we are reliant on different grants, we're reliant on donations. And the thing we're trying to kind of encourage local authorities to think about in their plans, and particularly if they're thinking about franchising or reviewing their enhanced partnerships, is kind of pull us in, kind of do that bit of mapping and kind of look at what services are you supporting, what services is the CT running themselves, and how are they interconnected with each other? Because that's the other bit that isn't always considered. We've seen this quite a few cases where an area will say, well, we haven't got the funding anymore, so therefore we have to stop this grant investment into this accessible transport. But what that then means is 6 other services stop that they weren't aware of because that funding was propping up the kind of services that are there. Our members, so Community Transport Association is a membership body, so we represent non-commercial transport operators across the whole of the UK. We did some mapping work last year to kind of look at actually who are we supporting, who are we serving. So just in England, and just for our members, which is about 600, 700 organisations, there's 13.8 million passenger trips a year. So that's not even the whole sector. So that's 13 million passenger trips a year. And actually, I don't think most local authorities are aware of who those passengers are in their localities. We also did a passenger survey out to our operators, and 46% of those passengers would not travel any other way. So if that service was gone, they wouldn't use the bus, they wouldn't get a taxi, they have no access to private car. And of those that would, only 12% said they would get the bus because they have additional access needs. So they would say we'd get a taxi because the taxi would come to the door. So there's a really big thing about how we can, no matter how many buses, so the government could shove billions into bus services, and you could have a bus stop outside everyone's house pretty much, and all these buses, there's still going to be people that are not going to be able to access that bus. So how do we think about those people? How do we make sure they have equal access to transport? And that's kind of really important.
Okay. And just let me ask a follow-up. So what I'm hearing is that probably the most sensible place for that understanding to be developed and maintained is at the local transport authority level. What do the local transport authorities need in order to be able to, and it's a fluid situation, I recognise, but to understand the availability of those complementary local services and then work how to integrate them better? What do they need to do that?
What we find works really well is when there is somebody within a local authority who has the specific remit for community transport. So there's someone internally that is knowledgeable, that is hopefully passionate and interested in it, but actually has a specific remit. So not its job 20 of 30 other jobs that it's got to do. And then also building really strong, robust communication channels, whether that's into a consortium of CT operators. We find that works kind of best because a lot of our operators are very small, so they're very time poor, as well as money poor, but they're time poor. So it's easier for them to share their views collectively and feed that up and feed that in. But having somebody within the local authority makes a significant impact on the success of integrating that service into the transport system.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Nick, you represent bus and coach operators. £1 billion a year, which the number Sylvia quoted, is, by my calculation, 0.5% of the annual cost of the NHS. Is that a big number or a small number? I guess it depends on whether you've got £1 billion or not. But from your point of view, how good an investment would, for example, another £1 billion a year be? What would that buy us, and would that be a good use of public money?
I mean, we would say absolutely. It's a fantastic use of public money. I think we all know that Britain is stuck in the middle of a productivity crisis. We have nearly 1 million young people who are not in work, education or training. The government is obviously saying they're laser focused on that and they really want to do something about it. That money, that £1 billion of money that you talk about every year, could be the thing that could be a catalyst and really change the fortunes of those young people who are really struggling to be part of the economy and be productive in the economy. So we did some research back in 2024 with KPMG, and what that revealed was that for every £1 that's invested in bus services, £4.55 is generated in economic benefit. That comes across in terms of people who are doing their shopping, people who are using the bus to get to work, of which there are 2.2 million people every single day using buses to get to work. And it covers so much about the vibrancy of local economies across the UK that it's not something I think the government should be prepared to ignore. I think it's also worth pointing out as well that we don't even know fully the extent to which congestion is costing our economy, and that this could be another way of helping to reverse that trend. So in preparation for this panel, I did some research into various estimates of what congestion is costing the UK economy annually. Some estimates range from a sort of 7 to 10 billion, other estimates range towards as high as 30 billion pounds. And that's people stuck in traffic all the time, not able to be as productive as they would like to, not able to get to work on time, get to school, get to college on time, and all those sorts of things. But also the way goods move around the country, how quickly we're able to get our Amazon deliveries and all those sorts of things. All of these things meld together to reflect the productivity of the economy. So if we are taking the low-end estimate and saying that it's only £7 billion a year that we're losing to congestion, and by the way, I would say it's probably a lot higher than that. That's a very, very conservative estimate. £1 billion a year for buses to help alleviate that problem seems like a bargain to me.
Brilliant. All right. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn then. So insofar as national government sets the framework, the regulatory framework, the policy framework, the funding environment for public transport, which is then enacted through regional and local authorities, if you had Heidi Alexander in front of you right now, what would you say to her in terms of what national government needs to do to secure the resources? Obviously, persuade the Treasury will be question number one, but to sort of make the case for this investment we've just been talking about in a way that will unlock these social and economic benefits you've all been talking about. Andy, if you had Heidi here, what would you say to her?
Accelerate devolution and local government reform quickly.
Okay. Yeah.
The context of this discussion in our part of the world is taking place in huge delays caused by government in terms of devolution. We were supposed to have a mayor for 2 mayors for all of our patch in May. That's now been delayed by 2 years. A lot of the investment funds and the powers for a lot of this was wrapped up in that. Likewise, local government reform. Each of our local authorities, as it currently stands, won't exist in 2 years' time. So the capacity in the system to think about buses is severely diminished and disrupted. The headspace of political leaders isn't in this space. However, once you get over the other side of that, there is a lot of opportunity. If we're saying that it's about place-based decision-making, bringing together the different economic actors in a place, it feels that is a place to aim for, but let's not delay devolution anymore. Pull back from this 2-year delay we've got. Let's crack on and do that as soon as possible. That hopefully unlocks a lot of the governance around this. In the meantime, how can we crack on with it? I think it's enhanced partnerships in our part of the world in particular have started to deliver a lot of benefits, so let's empower them. They are fairly well-constructed frameworks of operators, business and local authorities. Again, as I said earlier, sort of fairly thinly staffed. So if they're the framework to see us through the next 2 years of turbulence, well, let's empower them because they are having quite a lot of benefits where they're being applied well.
Brilliant. You and I both worked at Transport for London, which, even though it's often held up as the example of doing this really well, took quite a while to get good at it. How do we accelerate the rate at which regional and local authorities either get better again at this stuff or get good at it in the first place? Because obviously they've got loads of other pressures on their budgets, including social care in particular. How do we make sure that central government provides the right kind of developmental support to those local authorities, and what does that need to look like?
I think your figure that you outlined earlier on is quite a sensible figure in terms of the scale of investment that we could start to see going forward. So let's take an example. Norfolk County Council has had £65 million over the last 3 years, a lot of that in year one of the BSIP funding. But what it's been able to do through that is have a 27% increase in bus patronage over the last 3 years, because that package of investment has allowed them to start to deliver increased frequency of buses, improvements to bus lanes, better customer provision. It's the sort of scale that isn't far off if you add that together across the country, your £1 billion. They were an outlier in that they got a lot of money from BSIP, but it just goes to show that could be done over the next 2 to 3 years if that figure that you're talking about was applied.
Perfect. Caroline, same question to you about Heidi Alexander. If you had her sitting in front of you, what would you ask her to do, make available, put in place in terms of what central government can do to support this process?
We typically always ask for specific funding from DFT for community transport. The only funding that comes from central government that is directly to community transport is BSOG, which they would claim is a lot of money. I would claim it's not a lot of money. And then everything else, we're told, you have to go to your local transport authority. It's their decision. They make the decisions. It's the local places. But yet there's no specific guidance. So one of the things we have been continuously asking for, and we will always ask for, is we would like clearer, specific guidance that tells local transport authorities that they have to involve and engage our sector. Not that they should, which is what is in guidance, but that they must. We've also been asking for, in that definition of socially necessary services, which I don't think is very far away. I think we're going to get that soon. I have, although I've not necessarily heard anything positive about it, but I think it's coming out. But we've kind of said, well, actually, if you've got socially necessary services, particularly if they're non-commercial, then non-commercial operators should be your operator of choice. They should be the ones that are kind of delivering those services, because typically they're going to be ones that are not commercially viable. And if you're putting investment in, it should go in to those operators that are delivering those types of services. I would also have liked to see any projects where actually it's in the scope of our area that, again, they need to invest in us. The amount of minibuses that I see on the road that investment has gone from local authorities into commercial operators, it breaks my heart sometimes, because I've got operators begging me for money because they cannot afford a new vehicle. And I'm seeing millions of pounds going into operators that actually they'll disappear tomorrow, and that bus will disappear from that community, whereas our operators are embedded in those communities. That vehicle will get used until it's no longer usable. So they're the kind of main bits from her. I think the other bit is around to not forget that investment in capital of vehicles, because actually we see, particularly in the minibus market, that there is no EV electric minibus market. Right. We ask, and we have asked government, and we would like government to invest in the EV minibus market, because we're being left behind. We currently rely on converted, so electric vans that are converted into minibuses. So we would like to see that, because otherwise, come 2040, what are we going to do? Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Nick, same question. Heidi Alexander's in the room. You got a chance to. What would your members like her to do to unlock this investment to reap the benefits we've been talking about?
So I think partly it's about obviously achieving that investment, but then once we've got that investment secure, it's about making those bus services sustainable, making sure that they, because obviously I represent the commercial operators, broadly speaking, it's about making sure that they are able to make those bus services sustainable commercially, so that they don't have to withdraw services and they can continue to serve those communities. And the way in which, and luckily for Heidi Alexander, I've got three key points that I would raise to help her achieve that. And it's all really about making sure the government is laser focused on modal shift. Getting people out of their cars and onto public transport is the key way to make buses more sustainable. And so to drive modal shift, my three ideas for Heidi are, firstly, making sure that local authorities are devoting sufficient resources to bus priority measures and other measures that will speed up buses in their community, because that will make them a more attractive proposition to people who might otherwise not have used the bus or not thought the bus is very reliable. I think we're seeing average speeds in some cases down to 7 miles an hour at peak time in London. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes it could be faster for me to walk than get the bus in central London at the moment. And that's obviously potentially really challenging for some people, and with the Great British weather being what it is, it's not necessarily an ideal situation for many. Second thing would be to seek ways to make sure that the DFT is working with MHCLG and embedding buses as part of the planning system. Yeah. The government is talking a lot about building new homes. They're talking about new towns and new communities. We need buses to be embedded in those communities from the very beginning and not treated as an afterthought. Yeah. I live on a relatively new housing estate that is one of those areas that has been delivered a bus service as an afterthought. The roads are not wide enough. There's only one access road. And the bus service was put in so late that by the time most of the residents had moved in, they'd already been embedded with their car driving habits. And that, is preventing them from seeing the bus as a realistic proposition. So it needs to be embedded in the planning system at all stages. And then the final thing that will really drive that modal shift is making sure that all parts of government policy are pulling in the same direction on modal shift. So obviously what we have seen from the government, and I understand why they've done it, but we would say that the money could be better spent elsewhere, is they're investing a lot of money in helping people make the switch to electric vehicles, funding and subsidising the cost of an EV. In many cases, that's for people who are already relatively well off and could potentially afford an EV without that subsidy, or could make that switch. So is that money the best use of the money when we could instead be ploughing that into achieving modal shift? And getting that modal shift is what we need to sort of start that virtuous cycle that has the buses being more self-sustainable in the future, making sure more people are getting on them, and then they are becoming themselves more profitable, and that's putting more investment back into the system at the end of the day.
Brilliant. So the eagle-eyed amongst you will remember that on page 16, I think it is, of the Labour Party's rail reform document was a commitment to mode shift targets to deal with carbon in transport. Haven't heard much about that since they won the election, but we might want to remind them periodically, because there is, at least publicly, a commitment to that, but it seems to have slightly slipped their mind. And just coming back to this question of sort of local authority capacity and capability, roughly speaking, half of local transport authorities don't think they're very good at this. Not their fault, because they've got to do lots of other things with their limited resources. What do you think we ought to do to help the local transport authorities, Andy's touched on this, to get consistently better at planning, commissioning, overseeing local bus service, and particularly coordinating with other forms of transport?
So one of the things that we've been doing at CPT is we worked to produce a handbook and a toolkit for local authorities. And that was on the basis of how they want to regulate their bus services in the future. So what we did was we produced a handbook and an MCDA analysis Excel spreadsheet thing. And the purpose of that was to help local authorities who are going through that decision-making process about how they're going to regulate bus services in the future to make a really coherent decision. Because a lot of the time they don't feel they have the resources that they need, and sometimes they get some resources from government but not elsewhere. But I think it's also incumbent on us in the industry, CPT, to sort of be providing the industry's perspective and resources from our end as well. Yeah. So I think that can be really helpful. And I think, generally speaking, there are a large number of EP boards that are working really effectively and really well, and they are bringing operators into the conversation at the right time, and they're working in great partnership with operators to deliver some fantastic improvements. I mean, Andrew's already cited Norfolk as one example. I'd also cite Portsmouth as another example of somewhere that's really driving some fantastic improvements in terms of bus patronage, and in terms of improving things in terms of speeds and bus lanes and all those sorts of things. And those relationships, sort of really encouraging local authorities to deepen those relationships with operators and all other sort of community-interested organisations is key, I think.
Brilliant. And then one final question, and I'll throw it open to the audience. So it's an irony, isn't it, that buses are the most commonly used form of public transport. So some of you may remember there was a document called From Workhorse to Thoroughbred about buses. I think it might be when Prescott was Secretary of State, and then obviously Boris had Bus Back Better. And the irony is that although we're all saying that buses are the backbone of local transport opportunities for people, they still don't have the kind of status, arguably, they deserve in government thinking, in the priority given to them by the Treasury. What's going on there, Andy? What do you think is about buses that they still aren't seen as the thoroughbred? They're still seen at best as an overworked workhorse. What kind of challenge is that, and how do we kind of reframe the story about buses, do you think?
Yeah, I'll go back to my original point about buses being totally undervalued and underestimated in terms of the role they play in the wider transport system. And it's sort of thinking about it from a systems approach. The buses are an integral part of that wider local transport system, but maybe not the most, I guess, glamorous, as it were. But if you think about, we've always said in places like sort of Norwich, 80% of the traffic within the inner ring road area actually comes from the rural areas outside. The park, they're completely bypassing the park and rides, this traffic, and going in, because the lack of the integration a lot of the time between the thinking, and it's thinking about it as a systems approach. What can you do to give the bus a chance? I remember when we were both at TfL, there was this concept of the whole bus offer, and it was not just the bus itself, it's what you do with regards to the wider transport network, giving it preference over private vehicles. So it's thinking about it in this holistic systems thinking process. And so guiding, I guess, government more towards that, but that goes back to what I said earlier around a place-based approach, in that you kind of want government to let go of the decision making and give it to local authorities to come up with a place-based approach and not having to go back to DFT every year or so for can we have our next tranche of bus funding. It's here you go, here's your overall settlement, devolved for transport and economy over the next 10 years, and you work out how you do it. And that would unlock a lot of the blockers in the system.
Brilliant, thank you. And by the way, it's no coincidence that elected mayors, typically the first thing they do is put brightly coloured buses on the streets of their city region, because it's a very visible sign they've made a difference to people day to day. Brilliant. Caroline, same question to you. In terms of this kind of status of buses and your members' offer, how do we kind of change the story around that so it feels like the quality thing it needs to be?
Yeah, I think buses suffer a little bit from the same thing that we suffer from. So from a CT perspective, we suffer really badly from a perception point of view. When you talk about it, people often think, oh, it's an old dial-a-ride bus that only takes the older women down to get their hair cut, and it's perceived as something kind of sometimes unprofessional or cheap. And then it's also kind of seen as, oh, well, it's only for certain people. It's not eligible for, it's not right for me. And actually, we've got operators that probably got better buses than a lot of commercial operators, fully liveried and run really professionally. And our drivers are something that we don't shout about enough, I think. And it's also within the bus industry as well, but particularly for ourselves, because a bus driver is so much more than a bus driver. For a lot of our passengers, and a lot of passengers on buses as well, the driver is the only person potentially they speak to in the week, that actually they become a friend, a confidant. There's so much around that social interaction. It's not just about getting from A to B, it's about the quality of getting from A to B. And we don't share that enough. We don't shout about it, and we don't celebrate our drivers and kind of show that that is a really professional thing and something that you should want to get involved with. A lot of our members deliver bus routes. They deliver those. They're open to the public. Most of our members take young people on their buses. There's no age restrictions in a lot of cases, but it's a perception bit, and I think buses suffer from that a little bit as well, because it's like, oh, if you can't afford a car, then you get a bus. And we need to change that. Of like, the buses is a real viable option. It's a really good experience being on a bus. And I sometimes get the bus when I travel around. I don't get it locally because I live in a semi-rural area and it's a half an hour walk to the bus stop, and I can drive to my location and back.
See Sylvia about that. Yeah, she can sort you out.
In that time. And it's really terrible, because if it was closer, I probably would get the bus, but it's too far away. But I think that we do need to change those perceptions. That actually, it's not a backup if you haven't got a car. It should be the first option.
Brilliant.
For people.
And Nick, your members obviously think the buses are the bee's knees. That's your job. But how do we? What do you do about this kind of framing this image challenge? Because, as I say, regional politicians will quickly put better buses on the streets of their cities as soon as they can. So how do we talk up the bus, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose partly what Caroline was getting at is that old adage, isn't it, really, that the sign of an affluent society is not one where everyone who's poor owns a car. It's where people who are wealthy get public transport. So I think there is a real nugget of truth about that, I think, in terms of what we would love to see in society moving forward. I think in terms of the way in which buses are perceived and the sort of the status that they have, I think, again, Caroline hits the nail on the head, really, that they're perceived as sort of certain types of people, especially in a lot of cases for older people who may have a bus pass and get free travel that way. I think one of the things we've really seen over the last couple of years is more willingness on the part of local authorities to work with operators to develop alternative sort of fare offers and sort of ways of getting people onto buses by attracting specific groups. So we've seen sort of young persons fare caps in places like in Wales, and obviously the Scottish Government has funded a young person's fare cap there. We've seen rural communities and sort of often seaside towns and others running buses or services that sort of go to the seaside, and you get on the bus and it's £1 to take you and the kids to the seaside for the day, and that's run over the course of the summer to sort of encourage people to do that. I think that's a really good way of working closely with operators to sort of develop those offers, which can really drive patronage from different groups in society. And the other thing I would just say is also, feedback we've had from both our members and indeed passengers is they love getting electric buses. They love zero-emission buses even more than they love a regular bus. And of course, we all love buses, but the zero-emission bus is sort of the gold standard in many cases. It's quieter, it's more comfortable, it's been designed better in lots of cases, and people like things that are new. And when they see a new electric bus, they think, oh wow, that's really special, that's really spiffy, that's really nice for my community to have that on the road. So what we need to see in terms of that is continued focus, because we've obviously had great success with the Zebra scheme in terms of funding a lot of electric buses on UK roads, but we need to see that, not necessarily that scheme continue, but in terms of the grants that local authorities now have and the power they have to invest, we need to make sure they're continuing to invest along with the private operators to bring more of those gold standard buses onto our roads.
Brilliant. I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that there have been some very positive developments in national government policy in the last few years. So we've had now stable, longer-term needs-based funding rather than at bid for funding. We've got the ability for local authorities to regulate buses in a broader range of ways. We've got the fare cap. So I think there's some very positive things going on. The question is how we kind of build on that and leverage those developments, with continuous long-term investment to make sure that we unlock all these benefits. So we've got 10 minutes or so for questions. Who would like to ask a question of the panel? I've got a lady there and a gentleman there. If you could just say your name, your affiliation, and a quick question. The lady over there, yeah. And then we'll ask. And is it for anyone in particular or for the whole panel?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Feiko Kiakutelaki. I'm a service designer and currently I'm working for Kenos and currently working for DFT Bots. You mentioned earlier, and actually you continue to say that passengers love EVs, but I think what passengers love more is new buses. And if we are talking about the perceptions around buses, the cleaner, the newer, the more meeting the needs, like considering, for example, charging points or accessibility seats, etc., the bus is, the more likely I think it would be that the passengers would enjoy riding the bus. I also live in London, and I have lived in different parts of London. And there are parts of London that have older buses and other parts of London that have newer buses. And the experience is different, and the people who choose, consciously choose to use the bus is different depending on the experience that they have on the bus. Now, I do understand how expensive it is to buy a new bus, but I'm just saying that if we are talking about doing a PR campaign to changing the perception that people have about buses, that would require, I would assume, quite a big investment, but it would likely be the outcome that the better looking and the better meeting the needs the bus is.
What's your question?
It's not exactly a question. It's a comment on the comment that people love EVs. I think it's not just EVs. People love new buses that better meets their needs. And that is important if we're talking about how we can make buses preferable and the first option, as it was mentioned.
So Nick, let me just ask you, so your members obviously buy the buses. How do we make sure that they're able to buy, turn over the fleet, make sure that it looks like a decent quality of service in terms of the ride, what they get on it? How do we do that?
So, government policy has actually helped in that regard to a certain degree. So, as you guys may be aware, the government has brought forward a plan for essentially what is a phase-out date for new non-zero emission buses, and that's coming in at some point. It's no earlier than 2030, but there will be legislation for in due course, and that will really help spur people on to sort of choosing to buy new buses and electric buses and that sort of thing. I think the latest comment about absolutely new buses and in things being new is great, and if they're EVs, that's great too. I agree largely with what she's saying in terms of making sure they fit the passengers' needs. I think if we can fit passengers' needs and also make sure we're accelerating that transition to zero-emission vehicles wherever possible is really good. But one of the things I would also say is that oftentimes the way that operators will invest as well as buying new buses is also sort of retrofitting and converting old buses. And there's sort of brilliant work going on. I think it's down in Bicester where there's a facility where they sort of take your sort of Euro 5 and older sort of diesel buses, and then they rip out its parts and put in an electric drivetrain instead, which is fantastic.
Brilliant. So. Andy?
Yeah, I guess just to add, where electric buses have come in, for example, through the Zebra funding in Norwich, they've been really well received, particularly notable in terms of how sort of attractive they are, and the low emission element of it. I guess there's also a bit of a trade-off, though, with your sort of core hypothesis for this session about having a bus, and making sure that
Yes, that's a starting point.
agonising about whether it's EV or whatever. A bus is your first point in a lot of these places, and then working out what fuel does it run on, etc.
Yeah, brilliant. So on the kind of 2080 principle, let's have a bus to start with. Yeah, gentleman there.
Yeah, Neil McDonald from AECOM. Loads of really interesting stuff in there. I think you just picked up on most people, I think, are interested in, is there a bus? Is that bus going to turn up?
Yeah.
And more fundamentally, is that bus going where I need it to go? And there are so many communities on the edge of major cities, for example, where the natural planning assumption seems to be they want to go into the main urban centre, when actually the real shopping offer or the real employment opportunities are on the opposite side of the city or somewhere on the orbital movement. So I think that's, there's the experiences that passengers have, and some passengers don't actually have a choice. And it's not down to affordability. I know from personal experience why some family members don't drive cars, and it's not down to their wealth. So we can't assume that, the bus is the poor man's model. It's not. I think there is a other point here around. There's been lots of mention there about the role of the bus operator, and lots of mention about the role of the local authority, and arguably DFT and others. But just picking up on the cost of congestion point, at what point does it come the responsibility of local businesses, either as a consortium of businesses or major employers in their own right, to actually sponsor and infill some of these public transport gaps and bring all the social value benefits that it comes? So my question is really, what's the role for business in actually addressing some of these issues?
And to what extent are you able to work with businesses in the East of England to kind of pool resources? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the framer for this is it's an absolutely spot-on question, because a lot of the jobs that are being created are not in city centres. They're out of town. I mentioned Sizewell, at Ashfield Park, which is where sort of the BT campus in Ipswich. The Agritech Centre of Europe is on the outskirts of Norwich. You can't get to it. This is industrial strategy stuff. This is what is driving the UK economy. How do you get there, and how do you involve businesses? That's where in the East, business boards have been created by local authorities. They transcend the gap between local authorities and the business sector. Ultimately, will help mayors to drive forward growth plans. But I think it's through those mechanisms that you need to bring in the realities of this, because they're starting to pay for some of those bus services as well. I think it's absolutely right that businesses are part of this conversation.
Brilliant. So tragically, we're out of time. I'm sure there are many more other questions in the audience. So I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to ask those. If you want to grab any of the panellists, please do. If you want to grab Sylvia to ask her about this, or Devon, who really understands it, grab them afterwards. Can I thank my three panellists, Andy, Caroline and Nick, very warmly for their contribution. Thank you for your questions, and obviously we hope you'll keep in touch with us about how we then put this analysis into the system, so we can hopefully produce the benefit we've all been talking about. But thank you very much for your time, and see you soon.